The steam was the first thing. It rose in a great billowing cloud, thick as a low-country fog, smelling of lye and something else, something sweet and scorched and deeply, primordially wrong. It clung to the cypress walls of the laundry house, beaded on the cold iron of the great wash kettle, and veiled the face of the woman who stood over it, her arms submerged to the elbows in the roiling milky water. Her name was Phoebe, and she was stirring, not with the long wooden paddle used for linens, but with her own two hands, pushing down, holding firm against the frantic, weakening struggle beneath the surface. The water sloshed, a furious white froth hissing against the hot iron. A scream, thin and suffocated, had tried to fight its way through the water and the steam, but it had died in a gurgle, a final exhalation of bubbles that broke on the surface like fleeting, glassy eyes. Phoebe did not blink. Her face, a mask of sweat and placid concentration, was illuminated by the greedy orange glow of the fire roaring in the brick hearth beneath the kettle. The brand on the back of her right hand, a stylized W for Witherspoon, seemed to darken in the heat, a permanent shackle of flesh. She held on. She held on through the last convulsive shudder, through the awful softening of the thing beneath her hands. She held on until the water stilled, its surface now disturbed only by the steady simmer from the flames below. Then, and only then, did she withdraw her arms. They were red to the elbows, scalded and raw, the pain a distant hum beneath the roaring in her ears. She looked at her hands, the wrinkled flesh, the W seared into her skin forever. She had used these hands to scrub fine cambric shirts until they were whiter than bone, to wring silk chemises with a tenderness that belied her own calloused life, to soothe the fevered brow of the child they had taken from her. Now she had used them for this. She looked into the kettle. The steam parted for a moment, and she saw a swirl of blonde hair, fine as corn silk, floating in the gray saponified water. She saw the pale curve of a shoulder, the lace of a nightgown collar turning a dingy brown. She saw what was left of Eleanor Witherspoon. The laundress of Charleston had just washed her mistress clean out of the world. The night was a thick, wet blanket. Phoebe moved through it not like a person, but like a creature of the swamp, silent and low to the ground. The air, heavy with the scent of pluff mud and decay, was a balm to her seared lungs, a welcome antidote to the cloying, cooked smell that clung to her clothes, her hair, her very soul. She did not run. Running was for the panicked, the thoughtless. Running left a clear trail. She moved with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had been planning this journey in her mind for 1,000 sleepless nights. Each step was a prayer, a curse, a memory. Her feet found the familiar path behind the laundry house, the one that led to the rice fields. The moon was a sliver, hiding behind a veil of clouds, and the darkness was absolute. She navigated by feel, the rough bark of a live oak, the slick leaves of a palmetto, the sudden give of soft earth that signaled the edge of an irrigation ditch. The sounds of the plantation receded behind her, the distant bark of a dog, the faint murmur of voices from the overseer's house, the rhythmic creak of the main house settling on its foundations. Ahead was only the chorus of the night, the cicadas' relentless thrum, the deep croak of a bullfrog, the rustle in the undergrowth that could be anything from a raccoon to something far more dangerous. She welcomed it all. The world outside the Witherspoon plantation was unknown, but it was alive in a way she had forgotten. Her mind was a maelstrom, yet her body was strangely calm. The act itself had been a release, a lancing of a wound that had festered for 3 years. 3 years, a number that had carved itself onto her heart. 3 years since they had taken Sam, not sold him, not sent him away. They had simply erased him. A memory, sharp as a shard of glass, surfaced. Sam, his small, dark body slick with sweat, laughing as he tried to catch a firefly in a jar. He was 5 years old, all knobby knees, and a smile that could split a sugarcane stalk. He loved the smell of the laundry house, the clean scent of lye soap and sun-dried cotton. He would sit on a stool in the corner, humming a little tune his mother had taught him, a simple, haunting melody about the moon coming soon. He was her light, her air, her reason. And Eleanor Witherspoon had hated him for it. She hated his joy, his untroubled existence in a world she owned. Eleanor, with her barren womb and her face like pinched porcelain, saw in Sam's vibrant life a rebuke to her own sterile one. She found fault in everything. His humming was a distraction. His laughter was insolence. His presence was an affront. The flash of yellow jessamine. Eleanor loved the flower. Its sweet, cloying scent filled the main house every spring. She would wear a sprig of it in her hair, its cheerful yellow a stark contrast to her sour disposition. "A beautiful flower," she'd once said, her voice like ice chips, as she watched Sam play near the vine that climbed the porch trellis. "But deadly, Phoebe. Even a single blossom, if eaten, can stop a child's heart. Remember that." It had not been a warning. It had been a promise. Phoebe stumbled, her foot catching on a cypress knee. She fell forward, her raw forearms scraping against the rough bark. The pain was searing, real, and it dragged her back from the precipice of memory. She lay there for a moment, her cheek pressed against the damp earth, listening. The sounds of the hunt had not yet begun, but she could feel it coming. The silence was a held breath. Elias Witherspoon would wake. He would call for his wife. He would find the laundry house, the simmering kettle, the unspeakable stew within. And then the world would erupt. The dogs, the patrols, the posters. A price would be put on her head, her description circulated from Charleston to Savannah. A woman of medium height, strong build. A W branded on her right hand. She pushed herself up. The pain in her arms was a fire now, a fear, constant reminder of her sin or her salvation. She tore a strip from the hem of her coarse linen dress and wrapped it clumsily around one arm, then the other. The fabric was soaked with swamp water and her own sweat. It was the only baptism she would get. She moved on, deeper into the marsh. The solid ground gave way to brackish water that sucked at her ankles. Spanish moss hung from the trees in ghostly veils, brushing against her face like the touch of cold, dead fingers. This was the Santee Delta, a labyrinth of waterways and hammocks, a place where a person could disappear if they knew the way. And Phoebe had listened. For years, she had listened to the stories whispered in the quarters, tales of runaways who had found refuge in the Great Dismal or the deep swamps of Carolina, who had joined communities of maroons, living free and wild. They were myths, cautionary tales told by the masters, but whispers of hope among her people. She clung to that hope now, a tiny, flickering ember in the vast darkness of her fear. Another memory, this one of Sam's lullaby. "Go to sleep, little one. Moon's a-comin' soon. Close your eyes, little one. Day is almost through." She had hummed it as she worked, hummed it as she stirred the pot. The simple tune had been her mantra, the rhythm that kept her hands moving, her resolve from shattering. She hummed it now, under her breath, a ghost of a sound in the humming swamp. It was all she had left of him. The song, the memory of his laugh, and the burning, righteous fury that had led her to the wash kettle. The hunt would come. Let it. She was no longer Phoebe, the laundress. She was a mother, and she was a ghost, haunting the edges of the world that had tried to bury her. The sun rose not with a glorious burst of light, but with a fear, slow, gray leaking, that turned the swamp from black to a palette of greens and browns. The air grew thick and heavy, buzzing with mosquitoes that raised welts on her exposed skin. Phoebe found a small island of solid ground, a hammock crowned with a single ancient live oak, and collapsed at its base. Her body screamed with a pain that was more than just the burns on her arms. It was the agony of exhaustion, of fear, of a grief so profound it had no voice. She closed her eyes, and the laundry house returned. The heat, the smell. Eleanor's face contorted in a silent O of disbelief as the boiling water closed over her head. The image was seared behind her eyelids, a new brand to match the one on her hand. She had thought the act would bring peace, a quiet settling of accounts. But there was no peace. There was only a hollow, echoing space where her rage had been. What was she now? A murderer. A runaway. A name on a poster. She must have slept, a fitful, dream-haunted slumber, because she was jolted awake by a sound that did not belong to the swamp. The distant, mournful baying of hounds. It had begun. Elias Witherspoon stood on the porch of his grand Charleston townhouse, a glass of brandy trembling in his hand, though the morning was already sweltering. The city hummed around him, the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, but he heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the horrifying tableau discovered by his house cook, Martha, just after dawn. The laundry house, the still warm kettle, the contents. He had vomited into his wife's prized camellia bushes. Now, hours later, the shock had curdled into a cold, efficient fury. The constable had been, his face a mixture of pity and professional detachment. A report had been filed. But Elias knew the law was a slow, clumsy beast. He wanted something sharper, faster. He wanted a hunter. Silas Croft arrived an hour later. He did not look like the boogeyman of slave quarter lore. He was a small, wiry man with pale, watchful eyes and skin tanned to the color of old leather. He moved with a quiet economy, his worn boots making little sound on the polished floorboards. He was known not for his brutality, though he was capable of it, but for his unnerving perception. They said he could read a trail a week old, that he could smell fear on the wind. They called him the Hound. "Mr. Witherspoon?" Croft said, his voice a dry rasp. He did not offer condolences. His business was not with the dead, but with the living who had caused them to be so. "She's to be brought back," Elias said, his voice tight. "Alive. The law will see to her punishment. I want her to stand trial. I want all of Charleston to see what happens to an animal that turns on its master." Croft nodded, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the portraits, the silk drapes, the sheen of well-oiled mahogany. He was assessing the man, the wealth, the stakes. "Her name?" "Phoebe." "Any family? Husband? Children?" Elias hesitated. The subject of the boy was a raw, tender spot. "She had a son. He died. An accident. 3 years ago." Croft's pale eyes lingered on Elias's face, for a fraction of a second too long. He had heard whispers, as all men in his trade did. Whispers of a mistress's cruelty, of a child's convenient demise. "An accident," he repeated, the words flat, without inflection. "And the father, a field hand, sold down to the sugar plantations 2 years back. So the woman had nothing left to lose." Croft understood. Those were the most dangerous kind. They didn't run toward something. They ran away from everything. Their calculations were different. "I'll need to see where it happened," Croft said. "And I'll need to speak to your other people." Elias led him out back, past the pristine gardens where the air was still sweet with the scent of jessamine, to the small, windowless cypress building. The air inside was still thick, foul. The kettle had been emptied, its contents removed by the coroner's men, but the stain remained. A psychic stain, a residue of violence that clung to the very air. Croft walked the space slowly. He noted the overturned stool, the long wooden paddle lying on the floor, the neat stacks of folded linen on a shelf, untouched. He ran a finger along the inside of the cooled kettle. Then he knelt, his eyes scanning the pauwais, packed earth floor. He saw a faint scuff mark, a partial footprint. Small, bare, he saw a single, dark, curly hair near the hearth. He spent the next hour speaking with the other Witherspoon slaves. He did it one by one, away from the house, his manner disarmingly calm. He did not threaten or cajole. He simply watched. He saw the flicker of fear in the cook's eyes, the way the stable hand refused to meet his gaze, the stony silence of the older women. They knew nothing, they said. Phoebe was quiet, kept to herself, a hard worker. Their faces were masks of ignorance, but their eyes were full of knowledge. In the eyes of one young girl, a housemaid named Sarah, he saw something else, a spark of fierce, defiant pride. She knew, and she was glad. He learned little of substance, but he learned what he needed to know about the woman he was hunting. She was not a monster, she was a ghost, made invisible by the grief and terror of those she left behind. They would not help him. They would protect her memory, her flight, with their silence. He let his 2 dogs, a pair of lean, scarred Catahoula leopard dogs, get the scent from a dress left in Phoebe's small cabin in the quarters. It was a pathetic space, barely large enough for a cot and a small chest. Inside the chest, beneath a threadbare blanket, Croft found a small, crudely carved wooden bird, the only object in the room that spoke of anything other than servitude. He held it for a moment, then pocketed it. Psychology was as much a part of the trail as a footprint. The dogs led him, predictably, to the edge of the Santee Delta. The trail was clear at first, then it vanished into the brackish water. A novice would be stopped here. But Croft was no novice. He knew the swamp was not a barrier, it was a highway. He waded in, his dogs swimming silently on either side of him. He scanned the opposite bank, the hammocks, the subtle signs of passage, a broken reed, a smear of mud on a cypress knee. He was not just hunting a woman, he was hunting a story. And the story had begun with a terrible, boiling rage. He needed to understand the source of that rage to predict where it would lead her. The dead child, the sold husband, the mistress who loved poisonous yellow flowers. The pieces were there, scattered like bones in the swamp. His job was to put them together. And as the sun climbed higher, casting dappled, confusing shadows through the canopy of trees, Silas Croft, the hound, felt a sliver of something that was almost respect for the woman he pursued. She had made a clean, brutal end to her suffering. Now she had entered his world, the world of the hunted. And in this world, he was the apex predator. The baying of the hounds was a physical thing, a vibration that traveled through the water and the earth into the soles of Phoebe's feet. It tightened a cold fist around her heart. They were coming, faster than she had imagined. She plunged deeper into the swamp, the water now up to her waist. The bandage on her arm came loose, trailing behind her in the murky water like a pale snake. The burns screamed as the filthy water seeped into the raw flesh. She bit down on her lip, tasting blood, and pushed onward. She had to put distance, any kind of distance, between herself and the sound of those dogs. Her mind raced, sorting through the whispered lore of the quarters. Follow the water. It hides your scent. The gators won't bother you if you don't bother them. Look for the signs the old people use. A bent branch, a stone turned just so. These were fragments, scraps of a map she had never needed until now. Hours passed in a blur of motion and fear. The swamp was a living entity, both threat and sanctuary. A cottonmouth slid from a low-hanging branch just inches from her face, and she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs until it disappeared into the water. She saw the dark, log-like shapes of alligators sunning themselves on mud banks, their eyes watching her with an ancient reptilian indifference. She learned to move with the swamp's rhythm, to step where the ground felt solid, to use the thick roots of mangrove trees as handholds. By late afternoon, the baying had grown fainter, but she knew it was a temporary reprieve. The hunter was smart. He would be casting a wide net. She was weak, dizzy, with hunger and pain. She had to find a place to rest, to think. She spotted another hammock, this one denser, choked with a tangle of vines and saw palmetto. She fought her way through the vegetation, the sharp fronds tearing at her dress and skin, and found herself in a small, hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing was a ruin. The collapsed chimney of a small cabin, its stones covered in moss, and a few rotting cypress planks were all that remained. It was a ghost of a place, a forgotten homestead swallowed by the swamp. Who had lived here? An escaped slave? A reclusive trapper? It didn't matter. It was shelter. She huddled behind the crumbling chimney as dusk began to fall, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Her body shivered uncontrollably, a combination of cold, fever, and shock. The burns on her arms were throbbing, the skin tight and weeping. She knew the danger of infection, the swamp fever that could kill a strong man in days. Desperate, she remembered something. Mama Elspeth, the old woman in the quarters who knew the old ways, had once told her. She had been treating a burn on another woman's hand, a splash from a cooking pot. Lie, burns, lie. Moan as the old woman had croaked, her voice like rustling leaves. But the swamp gives its own medicine. The green moss what grows on the north side of the cypress, you pound it to a paste. It draws the fire out. Phoebe searched the trees around her, her eyes struggling in the fading light. She found a patch of the vibrant green moss, cool and damp to the touch. Using a smooth stone, she mashed it against another, creating a crude, fragrant poultice. She smeared the green paste over her burns. It was cool at first, then it began to sting, a clean, sharp pain that was different from the throbbing ache. She tore another strip from her dress, a dress that was quickly becoming rags, and bound the poultice to her arms. As darkness fell completely, she lay back, her head pillowed on the damp earth. The stars began to appear, pinpricks of cold light in the gaps of the canopy. The swamp came alive with its nightly orchestra, and in the exhausted silence of her mind, Sam returned. Not the memory of his death, but the full, vibrant presence of him. She remembered his birth, the pain, the blood, the fear, and then the overwhelming, world-altering love as they placed his tiny, squirming body in her arms. She remembered his first word, more, his first wobbly steps. She remembered the weight of him on her hip, the smell of his hair after he'd been playing in the sun. These memories were not sharp shards now, but a warm, enveloping tide. They were the why. They were the reason she was here, huddled in a ruin, with the hounds of hell on her trail. Elias Witherspoon had given her Sam's father, a strong man named Jacob, to her as a husband. It was a breeding arrangement, nothing more. But a fragile love had grown between them in the stolen moments of the night. Jacob was kind. He had carved the small wooden bird for Sam. After Sam's birth, Elias saw the bond between them, the quiet strength it gave them, and he had severed it. Jacob was sold south. Phoebe never saw him again. She had poured all of that stolen love, all of her hope, into her son. And then, the accident. Sam had been playing with a small kitten near the porch where Eleanor sat, fanning herself. The kitten had scampered up the trellis, tangled in the jessamine vine. Sam, laughing, had tried to climb after it. Eleanor had watched. Just watched. The trellis was old, rotten. It had given way. Sam had fallen, his head striking one of the heavy earthenware pots that lined the porch. Eleanor had not screamed, had not called for help. She had simply continued to fan herself, her face impassive, as Phoebe, hearing the crack and the sudden silence, came running from the laundry house. She had held her son's limp body, his blood staining the front of her dress, the sweet, sickening scent of crushed jessamine filling the air. He should have been more careful. Eleanor had said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Boys are so clumsy." The coroner had called it a tragic accident. Elias had offered his empty condolences, and something inside Phoebe had died. The part of her that could feel anything but a cold, patient rage had withered and turned to ash. For 3 years, she had nurtured that rage. She had fed it with every imperious command from Eleanor, every reminder of her loss. She had honed it with every load of laundry, every pass of the flat iron. The lie, the boiling water, the fire, they were the tools of her trade, and she knew them intimately. She had simply waited for the right moment. A sound pulled her from her reverie, a twig snap. Close. Phoebe sat bolt upright, her heart seizing in her chest. She was not alone in the clearing. She peered through the crumbling stones of the chimney, her eyes straining against the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was not the hunter. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, her skin the color of the swamp water, her hair a wild mane of gray. She carried a long staff and wore a dress made of what looked like patched-together sackcloth. The woman stopped, her head cocked, as if listening to something Phoebe couldn't hear. Her eyes, when they found Phoebe's hiding place, seemed to glow in the darkness. "You can't hide from the dogs, child," the woman said, her voice deep and resonant, like the croak of a bullfrog. "Not from the hound. He hears your heart beating." She took a step closer. "But he don't know the old ways. He don't know the water roads. You're the one they call the steam witch?" Phoebe's blood ran cold. The story had already begun. It had run ahead of her, taking on a life of its own. Steam witch. It was a name of power and terror. "My name is Phoebe," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The old woman smiled, a slow, grim stretching of her lips. "Names are cages. They gave you that one. The one you earned is better. I am Elspeth. Some call me the Swamp Hag. Names are what others call you. What matters is who you are. Are you a killer? Or are you a mother?" Phoebe had no answer. She felt she was both and neither. "The hound is casting circles," Elspeth continued, ignoring Phoebe's silence. "He'll find this place by morning. The smoke of your spirit is strong. He'll smell it." She pointed with her staff toward the darkest, most impenetrable part of the swamp. "There is a boat, hidden. It can take you down the river, to the city. Charleston is a forest of a different kind. A ghost can hide among ghosts there." "Why?" Phoebe asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" Elspeth's gaze was ancient, her eyes holding a sorrow as deep as the swamp itself. "My daughter was sold to a rice man in Louisiana. My grandson was born and died on the same day. The mistress said he was too weak to live. The master's ledger is full of such accidents." She looked at Phoebe's bandaged arms. "You did what many of us have only dreamed of. You boiled the root of the poison tree. That is a powerful prayer, child. And a prayer like that deserves an answer." Elspeth gave her a small bundle, a piece of dried, smoked fish, and a gourd filled with clean water. It was the first act of kindness Phoebe had received in years, and it almost broke her. She ate the fish ravenously, the salty flesh reawakening her senses, and drank the water in deep, desperate gulps. "Go now," Elspeth commanded. "Follow the path of the heron. It will lead you to the water. The moon is your only friend tonight." As Phoebe slipped away from the ruin, she looked back. Elspeth was still standing there, a silent, spectral figure against the night. She raised her staff in a slow, deliberate gesture of farewell, then melted back into the shadows, becoming one with the swamp. Phoebe was alone again, but not entirely. She carried with her a new name, a full belly, and the chilling knowledge that her story was now a living thing, a piece of folklore being whispered in the dark. She was the Steam Witch, and she was going back to the heart of the beast, Charleston. The journey downriver was a fever dream. The boat was a shallow, unstable pirogue, barely more than a hollowed log, hidden in a thicket of reeds just as Elspeth had promised. Phoebe pushed off into the current, the flat-bottomed boat sliding silently through the black water. The river was a wide, dark road under the slivered moon. The banks were lined with weeping willows and cypress trees, their shapes monstrous and skeletal in the gloom. Her fever rose as the night wore on. The world began to warp at the edges. The moss hanging from the trees became grasping arms. The reflections of stars on the water were the eyes of 1,000 watching spirits. She saw Sam's face in the ripples, heard his laughter in the whisper of the wind through the reeds. She hummed his lullaby, the notes wavering and thin, a thread of sound stitching the terrifying beauty of calm laughter, the night, to the unbearable landscape of her memory. At one point, she must have lost consciousness, because she awoke with a start, the pirogue drifting, caught in an eddy near the bank. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose. A patrol boat was coming up the river, the rhythmic splash of its oars carrying clearly over the water. She could see the silhouettes of 3 white men, rifles resting across their laps. Panic, cold and sharp, jolted her fully awake. She slid down into the bottom of the pirogue, pressing her body against the damp wood, making herself as small as possible. She used a broken piece of a branch as a makeshift paddle, desperately trying to guide the boat into the tall grasses that lined the shore. The pirogue was sluggish, clumsy. The patrol boat drew closer. She could hear their voices now, rough and lazy. "Heard? They got the hound on it. He'll find her. No one gets away from Croft." $40, the poster says. I'd track my own mother for $40. Their laughter was a brutal sound that scraped at Phoebe's raw nerves. $40. That was the price of her life, the cost of avenging her son. Less than the price of a prime field hand. The patrol boat passed, its wake rocking her small craft. The men hadn't seen her. She lay in the bottom of the pirogue for a long time, her body trembling, listening to the sound of their oars fade into the distance. The world was a web of hunters, and she was the fly, struggling at its center. She reached the outskirts of Charleston as dusk fell on the second day. The city rose from the marshes like a mouthful of crooked teeth. The spires of St. Michael's and St. Philip's churches pierced the bruised sky. The smell of the city drifted out to meet her. Coal smoke, horse manure, salt marsh, and the faint sweet scent of tea olive and gardenia from the hidden gardens of the wealthy. It was the scent of her servitude, and it filled her with a dread that was almost as powerful as her fear of Silas Croft. She abandoned the pirogue in a muddy creek and slipped into the city under the cover of darkness. She was a wraith, a shadow moving through the unlit alleys and back ways of a city she knew intimately from a slave's perspective. She knew which gates were left unlocked, which dogs were lazy, which streets were frequented by the night watch. She needed to disappear. But not before she did one last thing. It was a foolish, reckless impulse, a moth's suicidal dive toward a flame, but it was a need that burned hotter than her fever. She had to go back to the Witherspoon house. Not the main house, but her own small cabin in the quarters. She had left something behind, the wooden bird Jacob had carved for Sam. It was the only tangible thing she had left of either of them. A small, smooth piece of wood that represented a life, a family, that had been stolen from her. Silas Croft found the abandoned pirogue the next morning. He knelt, examining the mud on the bank. One set of footprints. Barefoot. Small. A smear of green moss and dried blood on the side of the boat. He touched it, brought his fingers to his nose. An herbal poultice. She was smart. She was a survivor. His dogs were agitated, confused by the overlapping scents of the city. But Croft didn't need the dogs anymore. He knew where she was. Or, at least, where she would be drawn. A runaway never truly runs forward. They are always pulled back by the gravity of the life they left behind. A memory, a person, an object. He had found the carved bird in Maid. His initial search of her cabin. He'd thought it was just a piece of whittled wood. But the cook, Martha, under his patient, unnerving questioning, had finally broken. She had told him about Jacob, the husband sold away, and how he had carved it for the boy. Croft now held the key to Phoebe's heart. He knew she would not leave the city without it. It was her anchor, her relic. He didn't go to the Witherspoon house. That would be too obvious. Instead, he began to move through the city's underbelly. He visited the slave markets, the grog shops on the wharf, the free black tenements. He didn't ask questions about a runaway laundress. He spread a different story. He let it be known that he was looking for information about a woman who had been seen with a small, distinctive wooden bird. He offered a reward. $5. Not enough to inspire great heroics, but enough to loosen the tongue of someone desperate or greedy. He was setting a trap, not with dogs and guns, but with whispers and want. He was hunting her soul now. Meanwhile, Phoebe was hiding in plain sight. She had found her way to the sprawling, chaotic world of the Charleston market, a place where hundreds of enslaved people, free blacks and whites, mingled. Here, she was just another face in the crowd. She stole a cast-off scarf to cover her hair and a burlap sack to drape over her shoulders, disguising the tattered remains of her dress. She kept her head down, her branded hand tucked out of sight. She moved through the market like a ghost, her senses on high alert. The air was a riot of smells: fresh fish from the docks, spices, blooming flowers, roasting peanuts, unwashed bodies. She saw a bounty poster nailed to a post. Her heart leaped into her throat. I'd laugh. Wanted, for the heinous and unnatural murder of Mrs. Eleanor Witherspoon, the negress Phoebe Setno of middling height and strong constitution, aged approximately 28 years, scarred with the letter W on the back of the right hand, believed to be suffering from a melancholic and dangerous state of mind. A reward of $40 will be paid for her delivery to the Charleston workhouse, or $100 for information leading to her capture and conviction. Asterisk. Elias Witherspoon, Esquire. Asterisk $100. A fortune, enough to buy a person's freedom, or to ensure another's enslavement. Every face in the crowd was now a potential enemy. Every glance felt like an accusation. The city was no sanctuary. It was a cage with 1,000 eyes. For 2 days she lived on the edges, sleeping in a crawlspace beneath a cooper's shop, drinking from a public fountain at night, stealing a piece of fruit or a stale loaf of bread when no one was looking. Her fever receded, leaving her weak but clear-headed. The poultice had worked. The burns were beginning to heal, though the scars would be terrible. The pull of the wooden bird was a constant, physical ache. It was more than a memento. It was her last link to a life where she had been loved. It was proof that she had once been more than a laundress, more than a murderer. She had been a wife, a mother. She had to get it back. She watched the Witherspoon property from a distance, hiding in the branches of a sprawling oak tree in the adjacent churchyard. She studied the routines, the comings and goings. She saw Elias, his face gaunt and aged, leaving in his carriage. She saw the other slaves moving about their chores, their movements slower, more subdued than before. She saw a strange man, small, wiry, with pale, watchful eyes, pacing near the slave quarters. He didn't look like an overseer. He moved with a predator's patience. Her blood ran cold. It was him, the hound. He was waiting for her, he knew. The realization was a punch to the gut. Her plan to sneak in at night was foolish, suicidal. He would be there, in the shadows, waiting for the ghost to come home to her grave. Despair washed over her, cold and suffocating. She was trapped. Trapped in the city, hunted by a man who could seemingly read her mind. She thought of Elspeth. Charleston is a forest of a different kind. A ghost can hide among ghosts. But how? An idea began to form. born of desperation and a flash of cunning. If she couldn't avoid the trap, perhaps she could spring it on her own terms. The hunter was focused on her past, on the small cabin and the wooden bird. But she was not just a creature of memory. She was the steam witch. She was a creature of lie and fire. Sunday, the bells of St. Philip's would ring, calling the wealthy white citizens of Charleston to worship. They would gather to pray for their souls, to ask forgiveness for their petty sins, all while sitting on a foundation of human bondage. Elias Witherspoon would be there. He was a vestryman, a pillar of the community. He would sit in his family pew, mourning his murdered wife, accepting the condolences of his peers. The hypocrisy of it was a poison in the air. Phoebe watched the church for a full day, learning its rhythms. She saw the sextons preparing for the Sunday service, polishing the silver, filling the lamps with oil. She saw the women of the altar guild, arriving with massive bouquets of flowers to decorate the sanctuary. Among them were fragrant lilies, white roses, and roi, to her astonishment, great bunches of brilliant yellow jessamine, the flower of her revenge. Its sins seemed the city itself was conspiring with her. She found what she needed in the back alley behind a perfumery, a discarded bottle that still smelled faintly of lavender, and a small clay pot. That night she crept back to the edge of the swamp, to the place where the jessamine vines grew thickest, strangling the fences and trees. Working by the faint moonlight, her hands sure and steady, she gathered dozens of the bright, trumpet-shaped blossoms. She took the flowers, the stems, the leaves, every part of the plant that held its deadly secret. Back in her hiding place, she used a stone to crush the plant matter, mixing it with a little water in the clay pot to create a thick, fragrant, and highly toxic mash. She strained the resulting liquid into the lavender bottle. It was a small amount, a few ounces of pale yellowish oil, but it smelled sweetly of flowers and carried the power of a lightning strike. Sunday morning dawned bright and oppressively humid. Phoebe watched from the churchyard as the congregation arrived. The elite of Charleston, dressed in their finest silks and linens, moved with an air of unshakable self-importance. She saw Elias Witherspoon arrive, his black mourning coat stark against the colorful dresses of the other congregants. He looked smaller, diminished. Phoebe had made her own preparations. She had found a discarded mourning veil, thick and black, and a simple dark dress on a washing line. With her head covered and her branded hand hidden in the folds of the dress, she looked like any other grieving woman, a servant or a poor relation. She slipped into the church amidst the final throng of worshippers and took a seat in the back, in the small section reserved for slaves and free blacks. The service began. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and the overpowering perfume of the lilies and jessamine on the altar. The organ music swelled, a majestic sound that seemed to mock the ugliness of the world outside. The minister's voice droned on, speaking of forgiveness, of grace, of the eternal damnation that awaited the unrepentant sinner. Phoebe's heart hammered against her ribs. Her eyes scanned the church. She did not see the hound. It was a small relief. He was likely still watching the cabin, the patient spider in his web. He was waiting for the grieving mother. He was not expecting the avenging angel. The climax of the service was the communion. The minister blessed the bread and the wine, the body and blood of Christ. As the silver chalice was passed from person to person, down the long rows of pews Phoebe's moment came. The back of the church was dimly lit, the attention of the ushers and the aided. The congregation focused on the front. With a swift, practiced movement, she slipped the small bottle from her pocket. As the usher passed her row, his back momentarily turned. She uncorked the bottle and emptied its contents into the shared cup. The sweet scent of jessamine was lost in the fruity aroma of the wine and the heavy perfume of the altar flowers. She did not take the cup herself. She simply bowed her head and prayed, not to the God of her masters, but to the dark, churning river of justice that had carried her this far. She watched as the cup moved forward, from the back of the church to the front, from the poor to the rich, from the enslaved to the masters. She saw Elias Witherspoon take the cup. He drank deeply, his eyes closed in a moment of pious reflection. He passed it to the man beside him, who passed it to his wife. On and on it went. A sacrament of death passed from hand to hand. Phoebe did not wait to see the results. She slipped out a side door as the final hymn began, melting back into the Sunday quiet of the city streets. She had not screamed or raged. She had delivered her judgment with the silent, terrible grace of a plague. But as she hurried through a narrow alley, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking her path. It was him. Silas Croft. He was not holding a gun. In his hand, he held the small wooden bird. "I knew you wouldn't leave it," he said, his voice a low rasp. "A mother's heart is a strong chain." Phoebe froze. There was nowhere to run. The alley was a dead end. "The church," he said, a flicker of something, not admiration, but a kind of professional curiosity, in his pale eyes. "Clever. You set a fire I wasn't watching for." He took a step closer. "It's over, Phoebe." She looked at the bird in his hand, the last piece of her old life. And then she looked past him, at the sounds beginning to drift from the church. A single, startled cry. Then another. A swell of confused shouting. The service had ended early. "Is it?" she said, her voice steady. In that moment, she was not Phoebe the laundress or Phoebe the runaway. She was the steam witch. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in the hunter's eyes. He had been hunting a woman, but he had cornered something else entirely. With a sudden explosive movement, she did not run from him, but at him. She was not trying to escape, she was trying to get through him. She slammed into his smaller frame, a whirlwind of desperation and fury. The bird flew from his grasp, clattering on the cobblestones. He stumbled back, surprised by her ferocity. The alley opened onto the wharf. The air was briny, the cries of gulls loud overhead. A ship, a big three-masted schooner, was making preparations to cast off, its crew shouting orders, its sails beginning to unfurl. It was chaos, movement, a chance. Croft recovered quickly, grabbing for her arm. His fingers closed on her wrist. But her skin was still tender from the burns, slick with a thin layer of sweat and grime. She twisted, the brand on her hand scraping against his knuckles, and her arm slipped free. She scrambled toward the edge of the wharf, not looking back. She could hear him behind her, his boots pounding on the wooden planks. The shouts from the direction of the church were louder now, turning into screams. The city was about to erupt in panic. Phoebe reached the end of the pier. The gap between the wharf and the departing ship was already a treacherous 10 feet of churning, garbage-strewn water. It was an impossible leap. She didn't hesitate. She launched herself into the air, a final, desperate prayer on her lips. For a single, suspended moment she was flying. Then she hit the water, the shock of the cold, a violent slap. She went under, the dark water of the harbor closing over her head, silencing the screams of the city and the pursuit of the hound. Silas Croft reached the edge of the wharf and stared down into the murky water. He saw the place where she had gone in, the circle of ripples already disappearing into the ship's wake. He scanned the surface, waiting for her to reappear. He waited, and waited. The schooner caught the wind, its great white sails filling like lungs, and began to pull away, heading for the open sea. Nothing, no head broke the surface. No struggling form appeared. There was only the slap of the water against the pilings and the receding silhouette of the ship. He bent down and picked up the small wooden bird from the cobblestones where it had fallen. He turned it over in his palm. It was a crude, simple thing, but it felt heavy with the weight of the story it told. He looked from the bird to the churning water, then back toward the city, where the church bells were now ringing in a frantic, alarming peal. He had lost her. Or she had been consumed. By the water, by her own rage, by the story that was now hers forever. He, the famous hound, had been outmaneuvered, his trap sprung, and his quarry vanished. He pocketed the bird, a strange and bitter trophy of his failure, and walked away from the water's edge, the screams of the poisoned city following him like a curse. The fate of the woman called Phoebe became one of Charleston's most enduring and debated mysteries. Some said she drowned in the harbor, her body carried out to sea, a final, fittingly watery grave for the steam witch. Others claimed she was pulled from the water by the crew of the schooner, the Sea Serpent, a vessel bound for the lawless ports of the Caribbean, and that she lived out her days as a free woman under a new name. Still others, the slaves in the quarters and the Gullah people of the Sea Islands, whispered a different tale. They said she had never intended to get on the ship at all. They said she was a child of the water, and that she had simply swum beneath the wharves, emerging miles down the coast to return to the only place that would have her, the great, dark, secret-keeping swamp. They said she was still there, an immortal spirit of vengeance, a protector of runaways, a story to frighten white children and inspire black ones. The Laundress of Charleston, they said, had simply washed herself clean of the world that had enslaved her, and in doing so had become a legend. Epilogue, 1958, Charleston, South Carolina, The young historian, a determined Bostonian named Eleanor Vance, ironically named, though she didn't know it, blew a fine layer of dust from the leather-bound ledger. She was in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, sifting through the private papers of the Witherspoon family, donated by a descendant a decade earlier. Her thesis was on economic resistance among the enslaved in the antebellum South. Most of it was dry, meticulous records of rice yields, slave purchases, and household expenses. But tucked into a hidden compartment in the back of one of Elias Witherspoon's 1841 ledgers, she found a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded black ribbon. They were written in Elias's spidery, elegant hand, addressed to his brother in Virginia, but clearly never sent. They were a confession. Mama 12th, 1841. Brother, I write this in the grip of a waking nightmare from which I cannot escape. The city speaks of nothing but the horror at St. Philip's. 17 dead. 17 souls of good standing, my own among the most grieved, poisoned by the communion wine. They blame the slave, Phoebe. They call her a demon, a monster spat from the depths of hell. They have put a price on her head that would buy a small plantation, but she is gone, vanished into the harbor like a ghost. They are right to call her a monster, but they do not know who created her. We did. I did. I see now that my dear departed Eleanor was not well. Her barrenness was a canker on her soul, and she poured all her bitterness upon the girl and her child. The boy, Sam, his death was no accident. I saw it from my study window. I saw Eleanor watch him fall. I saw the flicker of a smile on her lips as his mother screamed. Said nothing. My wife was fragile, I told myself. A scandal would ruin us. My silence was a spade, digging a grave for them all. The laundress did not just boil my wife's body. She boiled away my life, my name, my peace. She held a mirror up to my soul and showed me the coward within. I sit in this house, this mausoleum, and I can still smell it. Not the jessamine that took so many of my friends, but the lie. The smell of a terrible, righteous cleansing. I am haunted, brother. Not by my wife's ghost, but by hers. Eleanor Vance sat back, her heart pounding. The official history was of a crazed slave who went on a murderous rampage. But this was the story of a reckoning. That same summer, in a small Gullah community on St. Helena Island, an old woman sat on her porch, weaving a sweetgrass basket. Her great-granddaughter, a small girl with bright, curious eyes, sat at her feet. "Tell me again, Nana," the girl said. "Tell me about the steam witch." The old woman's hands, gnarled and beautiful, did not stop their work. "Hush now, child. Ain't no witch. She was a mother. Her heart was broke, so she broke the world back. They say she could walk on water and talk to the gators. They say she could turn lye to healing moss and flowers to poison. They say if you get lost in the swamp at night and you sing a real sad, sweet song about the moon comin', soon she might just leave a sign on a tree to show you the way home." The old woman paused, her dark eyes looking out toward the marsh, where the heat shimmered above the Spartina grass. She hummed a few notes of a simple, haunting melody. On a cord around her neck, tucked beneath the collar of her faded cotton dress, was a small object, worn smooth by the passage of more than a century of touch. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. What is justice when the law itself is the crime? What is freedom when it must be purchased with blood? The story of the Laundress of Charleston offers no easy answers. It suggests only that in the crucible of extreme cruelty, the definitions of right and wrong can be boiled down, rendered into something elemental and terrifying. Revenge may be a ghost that haunts the avenger, but sometimes it is the only angel a person has left. Her name was Phoebe, but that name is a cage. Her true name is whispered on the tide, in the rustle of the palmetto leaves, in the heart of every soul that has ever dreamed of turning the instruments of its own oppression into the weapons of its liberation. It is a story that did not end at the water's edge. It is a story that has never ended.